really appreciate you coming. We have people on Zoom also. So welcome to the Native Plant Society, Kinnickinnick Native Plant Society. The first thing I wanted to say was just thank you to Isabel and Vicki and Cindy for putting together the treats and coffee. And the treats were brought by Marilyn George, Randy Shue, and Cindy Hayes. Thank you guys. It's always nice to have that. Apologize for running out of coffee, but you know, we didn't really expect a huge crowd like this. So there is hot water if you wish. The only thing I wanted to talk about, just a little bit of business, is the fact that we each year select or have to vote on 4 of our 8 members on the board. And so the voting will actually take place in June, at our last meeting that we have. But right now we are looking for people who are interested in being on the board. And 2 of our people that need to be voted back in are Preston and Robin, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Robin, okay. And so they're willing to continue on for another 2 years. And George Gehring is one that would like to join our board. And so he will be on the ballot also. So there's kind of one more position that is open that we'd love for people who might be interested to let us know. And we'd love to talk to you. I think that's it. It's a 2-year commitment. And I'm going to pass it over to Preston and he will continue.
Okay, thank you, Shauna. I'm going to share my screen here for a minute, talk to you a little bit about the Native Plant Society. Okay, what's that? Teaching voice. Hello out there. Okay, well, I want to start first by respectfully acknowledging that we are on the traditional homelands of the Inland Salish peoples, including the Kalispel, Kootenai, and Coeur d'Alene nations, who continue to live here and care for these lands, its waters, and its native plants and animals. We offer our thanks to the Inland Salish peoples, their history and cultures, as well as their continuing care for these lands for the generations to come. Let me tell you a little bit about the Native Plant Society. If you don't know, and we have a lot of events coming up, and so it's a busy spring, and we want to let the people who need volunteers, because we are completely a volunteer organization, let them speak for a moment to tell you that they need help. Okay, so we were established in, see if I can get my picture off there. Didn't do it. Okay, get it up there. Okay, we were established in 1998 as a chapter of the Idaho Native Plant Society, and then in 2010 we became the Kinnickinnick Native Plant Society. And our mission is to foster an understanding and appreciation of native flora and their habitats in the northern Idaho Panhandle through education, conservation, and the use of native plants in landscaping and restoration. So we've got a big, ambitious mission. We have an arboretum. If you know where Lakeview Park is in Sandpoint, go there and you can enjoy our arboretum. And the trillium are blooming now. The first trillium I saw yesterday. So go out there and see that. I got to admit my wife here. She's waiting to come into the Zoom meeting. And by the way, we have about 10 people on Zoom. So we're going to try to be pretty respectful of their presence when questions are asked so that they can feel like they're, you know, part of this meeting too. We also publish a book, Landscaping with Native Plants in the Idaho Panhandle, and that's available at bookstores from Bonners Ferry all the way down to Book People in Moscow. It's a great resource. Let's try something else here. advance. Weird. Okay. Okay, we've got another. Okay, coming events. This afternoon, starting at noon, there'll be an iNaturalist workshop. It's going to be sponsored by the Pend Oreille chapter of the Idaho Master Naturalists and KNPS, and we'll be here in this room. If you want to learn about how to use iNaturalist to make observations of nature, be sure and hang around for that. And then volunteers are needed for the City Nature Challenge Bonner County, which is going to be in locations from Clark Fork to Priest Lake, and George Gehrig in the back of the room is looking for volunteers to help on that. He'll maybe pass around a clipboard for that if you're interested and or want to know more about it. Talk to him after the program. There's going to be a cleanup in Lakeview Park at the Arboretum on Sunday, May 1st. There's more. Okay, got more on it. Saturday, May 7th is the big 150th anniversary of Arbor Day, and it's going to be in Lakeview Park, and Native Plant Society and many other organizations are going to be present. That's why we're cleaning up the Arboretum early so that it looks good when people come. And Cindy and Bonnie, Cindy's here somewhere, and Bonnie are in charge of setting that up, and they need volunteers to help with that. John Harbuck is going to lead John and Susan are going to lead a plant walk at their house on the 17th of May, which is the 17th anniversary of Endangered Species Day. So, and we're meant to go out and find 17 different species on that day in honor of Endangered Species Day. KNPS program next month, third Saturday, May 21st, is going to be definitely a botany-based, botany and ecology-based presentation by Jerry Wilhelm from the Conservation Research Institute. He's located in Chicago area, so he's going to be coming in on Zoom, you know, like last month. Floristic quality assessment, what that is, we'll find out. And there are even more events coming up. Another cleanup on May 29th on Sunday. Those are usually at 10 o'clock in the morning at the Arboretum. And then the annual plant sale is at the Arboretum in Lakeview Park on the 4th. That's why we're cleaning up for that, cleaning up a week before that event. And that is our big plant sale. If you want native plants, come out, and we have baked goods and we have yard art, and it's a great activity. And there's going to be other events at that. The museum is going to have some events that day too. It's the first Saturday, so it's free entry to the museum, historical museum. And then last, third grade tree tours are in early June. And I know Judy's here and needs docents. And did you want to say a few words about?
It's not in June, it's in the last week of May.
Ah, I got that wrong. Okay, the last week in May. And do you want to come up and, okay, please do. You have to come back here.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, it's time to start planning for these tree tours, because we have already, I sent out a notice early this week. Within 24 hours, I had 3 schools this week respond. 48 hours, 5 schools have responded. Wow. And we are going to need docents for taking these third graders around and explaining to them the native trees in the Arboretum, along with their, and how to identify them by their bark, their needles, yes, and their cones. And I've made these posters for each tree so that as a docent, you have a little prompting cues about what to say. So you don't have to memorize everything. The students usually help you out by asking a few interesting questions or telling you things that their parents have explained to them. And it's a lot of fun. But we need to have quite a number of docents for this. And I'm going to be sending around something for you to sign to say, see if you're available. Please put your name on the list, even if it doesn't fit on the front, put it on the back with your phone number, because there's a lot of changes that happen between now and then and our schedules. Any questions? It's going to be May 24th, 25th, and 26th, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And we do it at 9 o'clock and 10:30. And I usually like to keep the groups down to about 6 to 8 students. They will come with their teachers and chaperones. So you don't have to do babysitting during the process. It's just talking. Yes, Shauna. Yes. I encourage you to sign up for whatever you can, and then we will refine the list as it gets closer. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'm going to send this around. Thank you very much. And let's keep it moving.
Thanks very much, Judy, for that. It's an important event to get the kids, involved with native plants. Be sure and visit our website. We're gonna have a new website coming up pretty soon. So it looks sleeker and all. Follow us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page, become a member or make a donation, and there's supposed to be a link there, but it doesn't matter.
Is that nativeplantsociety.org?
It is .org, yeah. Sorry, my face is in the way. Okay. That should be it there. Okay. Now I have to move my face out of the way so I can get rid of this file. Okay.
Preston,
Yes.
I also have a sign-up sheet for the May 7th Arbor Day celebration.
Oh.
I'm looking for primarily for people to help at the booth, and basically it's a self-explanatory thing. If you're interested, I can explain more after the meeting, but I'm going to go ahead and pass this.
Okay, great. Cindy's got the sign-up sheet for the Arbor Day. That's great. Okay, let's see. Let's get our program started. This is really a great honor to invite Dr. Molly Carney from WSU here. I'm a WSU graduate twice, master's and PhD, and I think you are too. So, and I worked there for 30 odd years. So let me tell you a little bit about Molly. She's an environmental archaeologist and a postdoctoral fellow with Washington State University and the Washington Research Foundation, which is a good organization. I was funded by them at one time. Her main projects focus on the plants and soils of the past, with a focus on how people managed or stewarded their plant resources and associated landscapes. She has worked in collaboration with the Kalispel tribe for over 8 years and is working with the tribe on numerous projects related to food security, restoration ecology, and cultural heritage. So please welcome Molly Carney.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. This is a wonderful get together in a group, and I'm privileged to be able to join you. I also have just a tiny land acknowledgement too, just that I'm very grateful to join you all today from the traditional homelands of the Kalispel, the Interior Salish, the Kootenai, and the Coeur d'Alene peoples, and that I'll be forever grateful to be able to work with many of these people and share some of the projects that we have going on collaboratively together. So it's working, perfect. All right.
Preston, can you use the microphone?
People are in the back. I don't know if they're gonna hear.
Okay, I can project more. Is that better? Okay, sure. And thanks for your patience while we do the PowerPoint swap. Yeah, that works. Yeah, and so should I try the microphone or is this better up
This
here?
microphone is for Zoom.
Okay.
Zoom audience, so we don't have a microphone that goes through these speakers.
Okay, so I'll just talk louder. How's that? All right, wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you. So I'm an archaeologist. I'm a little different than the normal speakers I would imagine that you tend to have. But today I'll be sharing some of my work. I'm also what I call a paleoethnobotanist. So I'll go over what exactly paleoethnobotany is today. But much of my work is done in collaboration with the Kalispel tribe primarily, although I have worked with a couple other tribal nations throughout the greater Northwest region. But most of what we'll be covering today will be going over some of these, some of our ongoing projects, looking into what people were eating in the past. And so past cuisines and past palates are quite different than the foods that we currently consume today. And they often centered around these native plants. And so throughout the Pacific Northwest, we really focus quite a bit on salmon as part of the main staple in diets and other trout species. But we haven't really focused as much on the plants. And we know that plants are reliable. They come back every year. They're honestly much more reliable than salmon runs in a sense as well, too. So we're trying to shift the narrative and just shift the gaze to thinking a little bit more about those plant species that people were consuming and how they were caring for those plant species to ensure that those plant species, those different plants would come back a year after year, that they were reliable and sustainable in a sense. And so a lot of our work is specifically seeking to figure out the ways people were caring for those plants, but also look at how and what people were eating in the past too, in some of their recipes. And we know that many of the tribal nations throughout this greater region faced horrific hardships throughout the past several hundred years. And so one of the things that we can do to not fix that, but to help get forward to a new place is to work together to look at some of those past recipes that may have been forgotten by those times and use archaeology to really supplement what people were eating in the past as well as today as well too. So this will cover some of those different plant foods that we know people were eating, but also what archaeology tells us that we might not necessarily have already known. So I just have a quick outline just to tell you where we're going to go today. And I'd like to reiterate too that if you have a question, just raise your hand and interrupt me and ask. I'd like to keep it a conversation and keep it fairly informal. And the same goes for everyone who's on Zoom as well. If you have a question, throw it in the chat and we can pause and talk about it. So the rough outline for today is simply, what is paleoethnobotany? What am I doing and what does it actually look like? And then run through some of the different plant foods that we've identified at a couple different archaeological sites throughout the region, anywhere from about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago up until present. I'll talk about some of those different foods that people were consuming. And so camas, I think a couple of people have mentioned already too. Camas is a huge plant food staple for many different tribal nations throughout the entire Pacific Northwest, including the Kalispel, who again, I work most closely with. Their health center is called the Camas Center. If you've been over there too, it's part of who they are, and other tribes in their traditional languages would refer to the Kalispel people as the Camas people occasionally. And I believe Jane brought a poster too, which has some photos and images of Camas. And I think you had a speaker a few years ago, Valerie Huff and Brenda Beckwith, who came to speak about Camas too, and that's their big initiative up there in British Columbia. But we'll talk about some of the other plants as well too, because you can't just eat Camas alone, right? You want to eat other things to keep it a little bit more interesting. And then I'll run over some other ongoing projects that we've got going on, and if we've got time, we can talk about other edible plants. But we'll just kind of roll with it and see how it goes, if that's all good with everyone. So just a little bit about me, so I can introduce myself to you all, because I do things that are a little bit different than what you all work on as well. And so I'm an archaeologist. I did recently finish my PhD at WSU. And so I like to describe myself in a couple of different ways, but usually as an environmental archaeologist, because much of my work does situate human environment interactions, or how people move within natural and built environments, and how those different environments influence human lifeways and behaviors and what we do in our everyday lives. And so I really got started on this path too, because I worked for the Forest Service. I think I mentioned this to someone earlier in our conversations before we get started, but I used to work for the Forest Service, and I was stomping all around Northern California, and I got to realize that these landscapes that we think of as pristine and untouched aren't, particularly in this part of the world too. Much of the mountains that we see, they've been shaped by logging or mining. And even the tree species and the compositions of the forests in this area too are different than they were in the past, because we've reshaped them. And they've been shaped and managed for really thousands of years. We're finally at a point where we have accepted that indigenous peoples used fire to maintain landscapes, specifically to target specific plant species in the past, and create open areas to create habitat for animals like deer, so that they could encourage them to come to these spaces and then harvest them. And so this has really inspired me too, in trying to look at the different ways that people have also manipulated their landscapes for specific goals and create relationships with the different species all around them as well. Oh yeah, sorry. Oh, all right, it's all good. Yeah, so that's mostly what I'm working on, and I just spend most of my time working on plants and as a paleoethnobotanist, but I've also done a lot of work with soils as well too. And we know that plants grow in soil, so it's a great complement as far as methodologies go. And again, you know, I have worked with the Kalispel primarily for the past 8 years now, and many people are my friends. And I also was able to, you know, live up here for a couple of summers as well. I worked as an employee for the tribe after I worked for the Forest Service, as a way of putting myself through school, working in the summers. And I lived in, I don't know if you're familiar with the Indian Creek area, but I lived there for a few summers, and I would come over to Sandpoint to do laundry. So I'm pretty familiar with this place. But now we have a strong relationship, and research oriented, but I also I go up there just to hang out too. So. And on the screen here, you can see that's myself and Jesse, who is a member of the tribe, and we're working on an experiment, and I'll bring that up a little bit later as well. So let me make sure too that you don't have to see it's not in the way. Does that look good?
Yeah, sure.
Wonderful. Okay. So what is paleoethnobotany? It really is just the study of past human-plant relationships. So thinking about how people used or managed their plant resources in the past, what they ate, what types of fuel they might have used in cooking, or what did they use to build their houses out of, what sorts of technology would plants contribute to, what sorts of wood would you use in bows and arrows or your fishing implements, what sorts of cordage would you make. Off the top of my head, bear grass was a big one that people would trade for throughout the regions too, specifically because it only grows in very specific mountain regions, right? So, but it makes a great cord and rope. So that's another one that people use that goes beyond just what people were eating too. But we're not just interested in these people-plant relationships in the past, because we can use what we know and what we learn to inform how people live today. So I have on the screen too, if you can see it, the text is kind of small, but this past fall, we actually had an experimental camas bake where we prepared camas in the traditional method, and Jessie instructed us how to bake the camas, and we were her labor. And so, but it was wonderful too, because we were able to invite all the students from the Salish Immersion Language School over to our camas bake, and they were able to sample camas, many of them for the first time, simply because it hadn't been baked in a traditional way for a few years for a variety of reasons. And that was really special too, to be a part of that. And I have on here, we were having fun watching the students tasting it, because it tastes very different than you would expect. For me, it's kind of sweet and nutty in a sense, kind of like a sweet potato, but more mellow. But cuisines for many of the people through this area would have been quite different than what we're used to. And so it would have been a much earthier palate. And so it was funny. They were like, it tastes like a flower. And so they were like, you know, obviously if you're trying something new, you're like, okay, but we'll work on it though. And that's one of the ongoing projects is to bring these foods back into, so it's more than just a class project, but maybe at least once a year, if not all the more frequently throughout the year. So how do we actually do any of this stuff? I threw a couple photos up on here too, just to show you what do we actually mean when we go out to do paleoethnobotany, because I mean, I like to hike, and whenever I hike, I check out whatever plants are near the trail or wherever I happen to be going. And I use that as a way to teach myself about how different plants live throughout different landscapes and ecotones and elevation and what grows where. But what do we do with that? How do we do something similar when it comes to paleoethnobotany? So I spend a lot of time in the summers out on sites, excavating archaeological sites with a couple of different groups, often with the tribe though. And so then I'll collect soil samples. So the first photo I have up here on the right, and you can see on the screen for the Zoom people, are just myself with a ton of soil in all these different breathable bags so that I could go and process them when I had time and they wouldn't get moldy. That's another issue that you have to think about. And then once you have all that soil though, you have to process it for these plant remains. So if you've ever had a campfire and you wake up the next morning and you see the charred remains in the campfire, that's that carbonization process. And so what you have there is a chemical reaction, but it's changing the carbon within the plant itself to a more stable form that will preserve for many thousands of years. I think the oldest site that I ever worked on was 8,000 years old, and the plant remains had preserved wonderfully. They're black, they're charred, but you can still work with them. Actually, the one on the far left is the 8,000-year-old camas bulbs that I was able to work with from Oregon. But what we'll do is we'll pour all that soil. I'll do it in buckets usually if I have a hose nearby, and then you can float the charred remains. They'll float to the surface of the water, and you try to break up gently the different clays or different soil particles associated with it, and you can kind of wash it off. And then afterwards you dry out your plant remains, and then you'll go through and sort them. And so that's the exciting, but also the microscope part too. So it's not particularly enthralling in a sense. I don't get to work with the artifacts or the beautiful things that people made in the past. I work with the little charred bits of plants and try to figure out what exactly is this twisted black thing that someone threw into a fire 3,000 years ago. But it is, I think it's rewarding. So here we have, just so you don't have to look at any more photos of me, but here we have what it actually looks like on a site. So the top photo here is actually from an archaeological site near the modern day Kalispel fish hatchery within that general vicinity too. And you can see some of that charred black within the soil profile there. And so that was actually what we think was a log as a part of a structure. So one of the support poles for a house in the past. And so that's what we're really looking for within a lot of these archaeological sites, is looking for all sorts of little black bits that we can then float and process and identify later on. And then the second photo I have too is what it actually looks like when it's all of these unsorted plant remains. And so it's quite literally, I took this photo the other day because I'm working on a project from, Pioneer Park. There's a couple sites around there too. And so they've sat in boxes for the last 20 years. And so I'm trying to do something with it for the Cobble Forest. Yeah.
Would any of those seeds still be viable?
So the question was, would any of the seeds be viable? And probably not, because they've been charred. There are instances though, particularly in the rock shelters out in maybe central Washington, where you would have seeds that didn't char, but because it's so dry in those rock shelters, that it might be possible to replant those seeds. And I know of places, I want to say the Middle East, for example, where they did that with dates and were able to bring back a species that had been, I think probably they took it out during some biblical battle, I think, in the Mary. So it was really important to the people in that area, but it's not that dry here, so it probably wouldn't work. But yeah, then we put it under the microscope, we sort through everything, and then we pull out, so we'll pull out seeds. So I have a couple different seeds up here too, just as an example of what it looks like. But I'll also do the wood as well too. So you're literally trying to look at the cell structure of these pieces of wood to try to identify what it is. And so like your pines will have these resin canals, and that's how you instantly know it's a pine. But other species like willow, you can only identify that it is in the Salicaceae family, and then you can't do anything more with that. So it's a mixed bag of what you can and can't identify, and you do your best. And some things you just have to leave at a particular family or a genus, but it's something.
So Chenopodium?
Yeah, so that is Chenopodium I have on here. It is related to quinoa. And so I'll be speaking about that as well in the upcoming slides. And so that's something that I haven't officially published on, but we're working on it. So I'll touch on that as we go forward. Did anyone else have questions before I move on? Okay, well, feel free to interrupt me as we continue to go on. So because the abstract for today's talk was, what were people eating in the past? What was a meal like in the past? I wanted to cover some of the plant remains that we found in archaeological sites that were maybe a little bit surprising or are very common in the sites, or even are just things that we don't normally think of, but that tend to pop up pretty frequently too. And so again, one of the main uses of paleoethnobotany is to look at some of these old recipes and kind of try to piece it all together too, to understand exactly what people were eating. And so this is also I have on here, that's an earth oven. So, and again, we can go over this a couple of times too, and you may already be familiar with it. But one of the best ways to cook food, if you don't have a contemporary oven, is quite literally to dig a hole in the earth, build a fire, heat up some rocks. You can pick rocks that will have different properties for associated with withholding heat, depending on what the rock is made out of. And then you put your food in and you layer it up. Usually it depends on what you're cooking and what sorts of green things you want to add and the different flavors. Think about common today is to cook your salmon on cedar planks. So thinking about the different types of wood that would impart a certain flavor as well too, will go into that earth oven, and then you cover it up and you come back in a couple of days and it's super easy and you pull it out and you have food. And so if you ever are around in early August, I believe the tribe has their powwow, and they do prepare buffalo in this way, and it's open to the public. So if you'd like to go join them for that in the future, if they do have it, I highly recommend it. It's delicious. So I have on here, let me see if I can move this so it's not in the way. Is there a way to make this smaller, this bar? Or I can pull it down to the bottom.
Oh, that usually disappears.
If not, it's okay. I just had the Salish words, or the Kalispel Salish words for some of these plants that I wanted to share. I'm still learning, so I'm not the best at. I've learned how to say only a handful of words, so I probably would not get it right. But maybe Jane could help out. No, okay. It's hard. It's a really hard language, but I'm trying. So I tried to include it for the plants that I know for now. So camas is a huge one, right? It's the plant that in a couple of weeks will start blooming around here too, and it's just stunning, and it grows everywhere. And because it grows so well here, it was a huge staple for many people, not only for the Kalispel, but people would come here from all over the place specifically to harvest here because it grows so prolifically. Now, you probably already know a lot about camas, so I don't have to belabor it too much, but yes?
When do they gather?
Great question. So traditionally you wouldn't gather when the plant is in bloom. And so you would wait until it has gone to seed for a variety of different reasons. Specifically, and I'll talk about this, we talk about some of the ways people managed camas in the past, is you could then identify it by the seeds and then replant the seeds too for future camas harvests. But we also were speaking earlier, I think it was Denise, about how you'll have these great huge fields of blooming camas in this area, but there's also another plant called death camas. And so at least in my experience, I've noticed death camas tends to grow in drier places, kind of on drier slopes personally, but it does sometimes co-occur with the edible camas, common camas. And so one thing that people would do is when it is blooming, go through your fields, identify it, pull it. So there's no chance of harvesting it down the line because it is very poisonous. Now, I have also talked to people who live on the coast, some of the tribes over in British Columbia on the coast. And so they shared that what they would do is they would take death camas and they would plant it in specific family plots so that they knew exactly where the death camas was, but no one else did. And so that was one way of warding off freeloaders or people who were coming to harvest without permission. And so, yeah, it's incredible. In some places, you know, like here, it's so wide and open that you really couldn't regulate who comes, but particularly on the coast too, where you have to actively maintain open spaces through those Gary Oak camas ecosystems or use fire to keep Douglas fir from coming back in, you would have to put a lot of work in to make sure that you could come and harvest camas, and that you wouldn't really want someone coming in and taking advantage of all the labor that you'd already put into this particular area. So that's one way that people would have marked ownership in that sense. And again, the flowers look different. Death camas is white, although we do know that common camas, the color of the flower is influenced by pH from the soil. So there are white versions of common camas, or even some of the other species as well too. But if you don't know plants, you might not actually see that, you know, plant blindness for people who, the term that's used to describe people who aren't as familiar with plants, they wouldn't actually notice the difference. So just be careful if you decide to go out and harvest is where it comes down to. But I also have on the screen too some archaeological camas bulbs. So these came from the Pend Oreille newsprint facility when it was, before that went in the 80s, there was a large excavation run by Washington State. And again, much of it sat in boxes for the last 30 years, but it was finally repatriated to the tribe, and it is now with the tribe's curational facility. But we took a look at some of the camas that came out of those features, and a lot of the archaeological features from this area, they do have a lot of camas. And so it's a little unusual compared to some of the other places throughout the Northwest, just because it is so abundant in these features.
I'd say people that pick huckleberries or people that pick mushrooms, they don't tell you where their places are.
Right.
So it's not unusual.
Right. So yeah, so for Zoom, yeah, just that people don't talk about where they pick their huckleberries or their morels, and sometimes it goes for camas, but I think camas harvests too are also about the social aspect as well. So in some of these places too, like around here where it grows everywhere, it's more about everyone comes together in the summer, usually like July-ish, and you hang out and you dig together and you catch up and then you bake together, and it's a whole process. And there's this whole social side of it too. So there are definitely plants that you would guard where those locations are. But I think, at least in this area, it would be more of an excuse to get together and have a party. Was there another question?
Do you pronounce the English word?
Oh, okay. So I'm very, I don't know, because I'm slowly learning. So I've learned how to say yes and no and thank you and a couple other things, but I haven't learned how to read it and then pronounce it. And so I have all the files on my computer, and that's one of my evening activities, is to do the kids activities and go through and listen to it. So I'm working on it.
Hey, Molly, I think the Kalispel tribe, John, on their website has a language section that you can actually hear the word. But I don't know if I've heard it a lot, but it's hard.
It is hard. Yeah. So yeah, there you can definitely find all of that online. I can send it to Preston, and you could send it out if there's interest where that link is. And there's also a keyboard too, specifically, that you have to download to be able to use these fonts as well, since it's a little bit different. And I can show you where that is as well. Were there any other questions? All right. Well, I have just a few more things to say about camas. I think I sort of went over this already too, but the actual act of even just baking camas is quite a long several day affair too, right? So if you have everyone coming into the particular region that you're at and you're all harvesting together, you also have to prepare and process camas too, so that you can eat it as well as store it. And so I like to give the Lewis and Clark story, and some of you might be familiar with this one, but they came out here and they were eating camas because it's what was a staple, and you can actually store camas for several years if you prepare it properly. But they would write in their journals about how they'd have horrible gas because if you don't process it correctly because of the chemical composition of the bulb, then your body can't handle it. And so you have to quite literally cook camas for 2 to 3 days to convert they're very complex carbohydrate chains. So to break those carbohydrates down into simple sugars that your body can handle. So that's why you have to dig into an earth oven, and you have to bring rocks to your earth oven and light the fire and keep the fire going. And you would actually, there's a couple different ways to prepare it. So every group has their own method as well too, and their own recipes. And so you would often layer with different forms of greenery. So around here, skunk cabbage is commonly used to wrap the camas in and bake it within that. When you talk to people too, they explain that they prefer to use alder as a flavoring within the earth ovens, as well as using cedar to kind of seal everything in before you throw the soil on top. Archaeologically, though, that's not exactly what we find. So when I've looked at these different camas ovens, I'll find a lot of Ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine, probably just because they are locally available species. I also see a lot of willow, and so I ran the stats on it, and I think that willow was probably a preferred flavoring in the past associated with camas or other bulb type foods. So that's a different one that varies a little bit when you go to people and you talk to them about their wood preferences today and what they would use to cook today. It doesn't always match up, but it's cool that we can find these different ways and that we could use it to experiment and make camas in the future. And then you'd also use, we've used like green pine bark too, and we couldn't get cedar for whatever reason. So getting creative about how you choose to prepare it as well as another aspect of consuming camas. I also have done a little bit of work with in the Willamette Valley over in Oregon, because they're fairly similar places landscape wise. And so what we found there though is that people prefer, there's a plant called bedstraw, and those seeds are all over the place in their camas ovens. And so that I think is a different seasoning choice that people were making in the past as well. So it goes to say that with different cultures, you have different cultural preferences for how you choose to prepare your recipes.
In the camas preparations that you've been involved in, do they use the what they call the black moss, the lichen? They still do that when they're baking?
Yeah. So sure. Yeah. So the question was about black moss, or this particular lichen that is usually used with camas. And so, yes, so I've had the privilege and the opportunity to bake with the tribe on a couple occasions. And sometimes they do include the black moss. And so the moss will also be put into the oven with the camas. And then it kind of gelatinizes, and you can make, they call it a pudding, but sometimes it almost looks kind of like a Jell-O to me. And so they do still consume it, particularly for ceremonies, is what I've personally experienced. To me, I think it tastes exactly like it looks, but I understand that everyone has a different flavor profile, and that I understand that's part of it. But it was great to be able to try it, and I'm really grateful for that opportunity to have tried lichen. Oh, there you go. Maybe I didn't have the right, I don't like licorice though. So Jane thinks it tastes like licorice. And maybe I just didn't try it right at the right point in time either. So
And I have a question about the willow. Since willow contains salicylic acid, could it, through some heat, leach into the camas bulbs and provide some relief?
Maybe.
Or would it degrade?
I don't know. That's a great question. And that might be something to think about, the actual choice of using willow versus today's preference and what that might have actually done chemically to the plant. And we should try it out and see if that's the case. Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Great question. Does anyone else have any thoughts or points they wanted to make on camas? Yeah.
Did they use the white camas for anything else besides trying to ward off, intruders? I mean, did they use it for like hunting animals or anything like that? Like, some poison arrow type thing?
Yeah, so about death camas and other uses. So I have read that some would use death camas on arrows or spears of some sort. No one's said that to me though. And so I've not encountered that in my conversations with people. But it's been written about. So someone must have done it or thought about it. Any other camas questions? Yeah.
Can you explain more the heating process? Like, do they heat the stones like for a sweat ceremony and put them in and then put things on top? Or do they build a fire on top of all of that? Or how did that work?
So it depends. Everyone has their own steps. And that also speaks to the cultural process of how you decide to cook things. You all have different steps when you prepare a recipe. So you can a couple different ways. You could heat the stone separately outside the baking pit, sort of like you might for a sweat. You could put the stones right in the pit and build a fire on top. And so that's how I have personally done it in the past. And then you pick out the wood once it gets to the appropriate temperature. You can also, what I've seen done is you'll put a big old pole in the center when you fill in with soil on top too. And then when it's ready, you can pull the pole out and pour water in to steam it. So not everyone does that though. I've also seen it done where you will have a fire on top for several days, or you'll only have a fire for specific points of time and you'll restart the fire every couple of days as well too. So it depends. There are a lot of different ways of doing it. Anything else? Yes, Jane?
Just one question, Molly. Because of time and how things change sometimes, it was always women only that did this work. Is that still true?
That is definitely true. So there is a gendered element that comes with preparing camas specifically. So, and again, just in my experiences as well too, anyone can come harvest. Anyone can come help bring everything to the site to prepare camas. When I've done it in the past, we literally got the guys to dig the hole out for us and bring the wood over and haul get the fire going. And my colleague Kevin had the blowtorch and he was having a blast with that. And but once it's time to actually start the process, then everyone has to leave. All the men do. And so it's just a gendered activity. So, but then once it's all in the ground, everyone can come back. And then from there on out, it's a community event as well too. So there are very specific roles within societies too that come with gender division of labor, but also with who's a part of what too. And that's how a lot of interior Salish societies work as well too. You wouldn't really have different classes of any sort. It was more just age and gender based and who does what. And then there's lots of I'll talk to you about another plant species, where children chip in too as well. Is there another question?
Can you just tell us about the layers? Because I can't read that thing.
Yeah, so the layers I have on here, they're very general. And so this figure comes from another point I'll make a little bit later on as well too, but I just love it because it's beautiful. So just the layers on this particular, can I use my mouse? Do you see it on here a little bit? So this would just be those rocks that you'd want to heat up. within your oven, depending on whatever method that you choose to use. Then you have different layers of just generally greenery. And so you could use alder branches with fresh leaves is one preferred way of layering food. And you could use, I've seen archaeologically pine needles was another one that people would use as well. So it depends again on your preference. And you might have these different layers at different points as well too. So sometimes people will put in like logs right on top of the rocks themselves too before you start layering greenery on. It depends. Then you'll have your packets of food. If it's camas, it would be generally wrapped in skunk cabbage. Today we just use bags, pillowcases. But it depends on what you've got. You usually have another layer. So sometimes there might be more branches. Ferns are another greenery that might be added to. I've also, and then I don't have it on this particular diagram, but you might have cedar or some sort of bark as well too, to really help keep the steam in the heat in place as well. So this is a general diagram. And then I have on this one too, I have a couple different types of foods that we've found within these earth ovens as well too, to illustrate that these cooking features were probably, because it takes a little time to build one, to dig it out and haul a bunch of rocks over. So people would probably cook different recipes in them and come back to the same places time after time. So that's why I have on here, we have, I'll cover, you know, huckleberries, pine cones, meat would be cooked in these ovens as well too. So they're used for a variety of different types of food. Well, if you guys are good, we can come back to it, but I just wanted to touch on a few other plants that people ate in the past as well too. Just so we can check some other things out. I wish I could move this. How's that? Is that a little better? Okay, I'll just try to keep an eye on it and move it depending on what's on the screen. So another root food, it's an edible bulb, is nodding onion, which grows pretty commonly in this area as well too. And so it is, you know, found in I've seen it in meadows generally, but you can find it in other places, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, Wilbur. But for both interior and coastal peoples and the people in this valley in particular, nodding onion is pretty common. It's common everywhere and people like to cook with it. And if you think about some of those earthy flavor profiles we were talking about earlier too, onions are pretty strong. They're pretty pungent. They definitely add a little pack to whatever you're eating, a little pow. So it's not surprising that you would target onions too, to give your foods a little different spin flavor wise as well too. And with nodding onion, we know that people could steam them. I've seen them steamed within earth oven features. So I have on here this charred little bit. That's a nodding onion from, I don't remember how old this one is, but I think it's within the last 2,000 years or so. And well, that's just the site that it's from. Most of these photos are from a couple different sites that date to that area. But yeah, so that is an onion. And so on here I have a scanning electron micrograph. So just using a special microscope at Washington State. And you can see, if you ever did if you remember way back when you would peel off the skin of the onion, throw it on a slide and stick it under a microscope. So if you look really closely, you can see that those cells look like onion cells. And so this is one where usually the cells to all of the alliums generally look around the same, at least in my experience. But you can tell that this is nodding onion just because of the shape. And so the other edible onions throughout this region, like Hooker's onion, are little round balls. So you know that this is probably nodding onion. You could also boil them. Boiling foods is pretty common as well, using either baskets or in-ground facilities, and you'd put a skin in there to keep the water, and then you'd heat your rocks and throw your rocks in to boil foods. So that's another good way to do it. And then you could roast them, and I think you could dry them too. And I don't know, no one's really told me how specifically that you could dry them, but it's definitely possible. So you can still use those onions too later on in the winter when they're not growing anymore. They've also been found very commonly in archaeological sites throughout British Columbia. There are quite a few, there's a few paleoethnobotanists in British Columbia who do a lot of work, and they've noted that they found nodding onion in a couple different sites up there. It's pretty hard to find some of these root foods in archaeological sites just because they're soft, they're fleshy. The chances of them preserving are much lower than maybe a hard seed or a piece of wood as well, based on the structures of the plants themselves and that particular plant organ. So, but they're common archaeologically. They were pretty favored in the past. A few more different plants. Does anyone have a nodding onion question? Okay. There we go. Okay. So another one is berries. Huckleberries or blueberries there's so many species throughout this region that are edible, and they were highly valued by people in the past, and they're highly valued today. It's what, $40 a gallon was the last time I was out. Anyway, so people loved them in the past and they love them today for those specific reasons. I generally will only find a couple different seeds in every site, but if you could see on here too, the scale is covered, but they're tiny. So there's a good reason why I don't find a ton of those seeds. That there's such a small chance of them actually preserving in a fire that just the fact that we find them is exciting. They could be eaten fresh. You could also dry or smoke your berries to preserve them. And so I've seen reports of archaeological sites too, where they were able to identify these smoking pits too, where they would create a fire and have the berries on top and preserve the berries that particular way. And you could smash them into cakes is another common way of preserving berries in the past. And so I have a couple more species too that I'd love to cover, but Jane brought in some foam berries too as well. So I thought I'd pass those around. And so foam berry is another type of berry that you might be more familiar with, and you can whip it up. And maybe Jane could talk about how you whip it up. I haven't found these archaeologically, but I have found patches and shared them with people where to find them in this area. But did you want to explain how it's done, Jane?
Are you sure? Okay.
You want to come up here and do it?
My
for the
favorite
screen?
story about, so fall berries are buffalo berries. Oh, gotta get over there, sorry.
Forgot.
It's okay. We all do.
Thank you, Molly.
Yeah.
Well, so does this work?
You're good. You're on.
Okay, so buffalo berries, and they would collect them and usually dry them, or at least Alice Ignis was the elder who first taught me about what they call foam berries, because they make Indian ice cream out of it. And when you look, you're welcome to open the lid and just kind of take a look at them. But they would dry them and then just take a handful, not very many at all, and reconstitute them with a little bit of water. And it doesn't take much. And they would use then a whisk. This particular whisk is snowberry that I got in my front yard. And I've actually seen it also used, the Salish on the Flathead, some of the Kalispel people over there used syringa whisk. But you whip it like you would an egg white, and it literally foams up. So you would drain the juice from the berries so you just have that water. And again, you don't need very much. And I had a jar with some of the juice, but I left it in my fridge, sorry. Anyway, you just whip it up and it turns into like this amazing foam. Now they would add wild strawberries, huckleberries, because it's a very bitter berry. But like Molly was saying, bitter is part of their food. They liked bitter, like we like sweet, they really preferred bitter. But Alice always talked about putting sugar in with it. And so that was sort of the, colonial addition. And, but whip it up and then they would just eat it and it stays up and foamy. And we would, that would be dessert after a camas bake. And it was one of her favorite things. So she always had foam berries in there. And just a quick thing, if you think maybe using something other than a natural whisk will work, no. There's something about the plant connecting with the other plant. The communication is magic. I've seen them try everything from an egg beater to an electric beater. This doesn't work. As soon as you add the snowberry or the syringa whisk, whoosh, just like that. Anyway, you can pass that around too.
Yeah. Oh, I'm learning stuff too. Yeah.
Okay, she said it's buffalo berries, and then she also said, so.
Foamberry. So
Oh,
foamberry or buffalo berry is the name of
So is that the ones you see on the plants kind of all over the place?
They're very tiny.
so snowberries you see all over the place. So snowberry is what the whisk is made out of.
That's what the whisk is.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And then foamberry or buffalo berry are the berries themselves that you would use, and they grow on shrubs not that tall with like silvery leaves,
And they're
kind of
male
fuzzy.
and female.
I didn't know that.
Male bushes and female bushes. Bear their own energy.
There you go. Yeah. I'm learning a ton. This is great. Yeah. So just like one more comment on the foam berries or buffalo berries too, is that, you would dry them, as Jane explained, and then you would trade them widely too, because again, they grow in forested environments, and again, highly desired and valued by people throughout the region too for that snack. And I know that people will eat the ice cream or the whipped foam berry too. I mean, I've seen it up in Alaska as well too, because they grow that far. So it's really popular for a wide variety of people. So I've not tried that one, and I would love to. But we also, the other thing too that I did want to comment on today as well is that we're going over all of these wonderful edible uses of plants. But we should, if you do want to try to prepare some of these things, you should be respectful where you go to harvest as well too. Make sure that you have permission to harvest some of these plants, and that you don't take too much either, because we want to keep it for the future generations and really just sample, not over harvest in a sense. Let's see. So one more berry to go over as well too. A couple of berries. Berries are a huge part of past diets as well too, because they do add a little bit of flavoring and a little of that sweet to balance out the bitter. Chokecherries I find very commonly in archaeological sites as well too. And so again, you could eat them as a snack, fresh. You could dry them. They're often added to, I think, pemmican with meat too, and dried and taken on long journeys as well. And again, you would often probably smash them up, and that's probably why we do find the seeds too, because you're pulverizing the berry and the seeds are popping out, and these seeds are a little bit bigger, so they tend to show up a little bit more. So that's something else that we have to think about archaeologically, is even though you have 20 of this particular seed and 3 of the other ones, how big are they? What representation is? Can you actually identify how much food they were cooking at this particular time? There are a lot of big questions, and sometimes it's just a presence absence. We have this plant, we don't have this plant, so this is all we can say at this particular time. Chokecherry also has been pretty commonly found throughout most of the Columbia Plateau, the interior Northwest, and a lot of different sites. So this is another common one that I encounter a lot, and that seems to have been pretty widespread and definitely a preference among many different groups. So not just the Kalispel, but lots of people. Another berry I don't have on here as well that was a preference for Kalispel people when you talk to people, but also just from notes and things, is Hawthorne is a big one as well. So I see Hawthorne seeds all the time because those are a little bit bigger, and they've come in only really in the archaeological sites in this area. I haven't seen them from other sites throughout the greater interior Northwest. And that's one too that you go back and you flick through some of the notes from people who are settlers who are in this area, and they comment that the Kalispel really liked Hawthorne, and which is crazy because, well, not crazy, it's great. I just think about every time I've waded through a Hawthorne bush and just been totally scraped up by it. And they tend to colonize archaeological sites too. So you'll often find them within archaeological features, probably because those features have lots of good stuff in the soil associated with it. And it's challenging to work within those.
Mom,
Yeah.
what about service berry?
So serviceberry is another one that's really common, and I don't see serviceberry a lot in this valley. And I don't know why, but it's usually found in slightly drier places, right? So serviceberry.
We have a lot of.
Yeah, there you go. Then I don't know why I don't see it. And maybe that's another cultural preference as well. But I don't have them in, and I haven't looked at every single archaeological site from this area, right? So it could just be that the ones I have looked at don't have serviceberry in them.
Well, in working with elders, I think they would dry them,
Mhm.
but they also use them like in winter for soups and things.
Mm.
And I learned the hard way that you pick them when they're really just becoming ripe. And
Oh.
the seeds are very small, but a lot of people complain about service berries because of the seeds. And then they get mealy.
Mhm.
Well, those are like overripe and not good to use at all. So, learning when to pick them
Mhm.
is the secret. And those seeds are very, very tiny. So maybe that's why you find it.
So I have a couple of thoughts. So Jane just was explaining that from her work with elders, they've explained that that you have to learn from elders the specific timing of when to harvest. And that's very important, and that the seeds would be smaller because you're harvesting right when they're fresh. So I know from other archaeological sites from other regions, so like up in British Columbia, if you just go straight north from here, they're very common in different sites. And maybe it is just different timings or different there's something culturally probably associated with that rather than availability. Yeah. Elderberry is another one that I don't see a lot, and you would think you would see it. And I know that on the coast there are tons of sites with hundreds of elderberry seeds, and particularly up in what's that site? On the Fraser River, there's a couple big archaeological sites, and so they have hundreds of elderberry seeds, and I don't see them, and I don't know why. Because like when I go exploring around here, I see elderberry, so I don't know what's up with that. And again, it could just be that's because we haven't found the site that has all this stuff in it. Because we're constrained by where we can dig based on the dams currently. So that impacts what we know about the past, or there could be something else going on. So.
Oregon grape.
We'll just go through them all. I've seen a couple Oregon grape as well, but I also know that Oregon grape would be used for dyes, so not just edible for the yellow dye. So again, that's not one that I don't have it on the top of my head where I've seen it necessarily, and I haven't. That one hasn't come up in my personal conversations with folks, so I couldn't talk to it. But maybe Jane would have a better feel on it.
Because actually, I was told it was used more as medicine.
Okay. So yeah, I'm used more as medicine. It depends. Everyone has a different way of working with and interacting with plants. But I think that's part of why it's great to work together and collaborate on these things too, because you do get to learn all of the nuances associated with many of these other plants that were really important to people in the past. So I know I've been talking for a while, so I'll just maybe I'll run through just a couple quick more species that I thought were cool and that were a little interesting, and then just tell you about some projects that we've got going on and wrap it up, because this has been great. I love it. I've learned a lot, and it's been fun to talk to everyone. So another one that I do find fairly frequently are pine nuts, and so we know that you can spend a lot of money to buy pine nuts to make pesto today. We know that in the Southwest, pinyon was a huge part of people's diets in the Great Basin as well too. And there's been a lot of work in thinking about how you would harvest pine cones and use that as something that you could store over the winter too, and then prepare when you are ready to. But when you talk to people and when you flip back through some of the old notes, it doesn't really often come up as something that is part of the diet. But I've got on here an archaeological pine cone. I think that one is a smaller one too. So that one could just be from a fire, but I do have lots of pine seeds as well too. And that to me, so I've got a Ponderosa pine seed up on the screen. So that could have been part of it. We know that white bark pine would have been a delightful snack probably for people. And we think that in my conversations with people too, it's been posited that maybe it's a children's task when you're out harvesting berries or something. You want to get the kids doing something and you send them up the trees to pick pine cones. And then you can, again, you can throw your pine cones in with whatever else you're baking, or maybe you pull out your current meal and you throw the pine cones in on top, or you cook them as a snack prior to your foods. And a lot of, with some species as well too, you need heat to get those open if you harvest them a little early or before they're technically ripe or what have you. So there's a lot to be thought about. And I've looked at reports for all over the area and no one really talks about it, but like almost like clockwork within a lot of these site reports, you'll see 1 to 2 pine seeds. And sometimes people just leave it at, pine seed. They don't go further and talk about, what specific type of pine it is. So I don't know, because you're reading something and you can't actually look at what they're working on. I don't know to the extent of it, but I think it's something that we could consider and talk about in the future too, is just even just something to have a snack, because I don't know, pine nuts are delicious. So maybe we could play around with it and try the different pine species of the area and think about how hard it is and how you'd actually cook them. And then the last one too that there's 2 more really quickly. So this other one, we talked about Chenopodium really briefly as well earlier in the beginning of this. And so this is another one that I've found really commonly in many archaeological sites. And so people often write it off as a weedy species that, grows undisturbed areas and that it's just an accidental inclusion in your archaeological site. But man, I've found hundreds of these things. And there's another archaeological site up in British Columbia, and they found thousands of them, and they've found a couple of different sites where they find thousands of them. And so there's no way that that's just an accident. So and we know Chenopodium has been domesticated a number of times throughout the planet. Excuse me. So we know that, in the Andes, which is where you get quinoa today, they domesticated a couple different types of quinoa. In the eastern woodlands, so in like Kentucky and Tennessee, we know that they also domesticated a type of Chenopodium as well too, Chenopodium berlandia, I think. Excuse me. And so I've been working with paleoethnobotanists from all the way up in British Columbia down to California, and we're going to put together a piece too, bringing all this together, because they've also noticed in California, in drier places, they tend to find hundreds and thousands of these seeds. It's one of the most common seeds in their sites too. So that this might be one of those foods too that fell out of favor, was lost from collective memory, that we could also look to in the future as well as something that people could eat too, because it's pretty easy to just grab a bunch if you just knock the bush into your basket. So
They're also called manchester.
yes, yeah. So that's another one as well that we're playing around with, that our paleoethnobotany has revealed to us. And then finally, I find a lot of kinnikinnick, and I thought I'd bring it up in sites as well. And I think too, there's a couple of reasons why, but the seeds are really hard. So I think they are a little overrepresented in archaeological sites too. They just preserve better. But excuse me. We know that the leaves would have been used to smoke in pipes as a part of a social gathering. The berries are sometimes, people describe them as mealy again as well too, and I've tried them and they are kind of mealy. But maybe they were also part of that seasoning, that flavor profile. Maybe people smoke them. There's some reason that they're getting into archaeological sites, and we've thrown around a couple different ideas, and so there are a couple different ways that they could have been introduced. But maybe they were also something, they also stay on the bushes pretty long throughout the season as well. So it might just be something that's available all through the winter. And so when you have a tough winter, you can go grab some berries and then you've got something to eat. As like this time of year too would be probably pretty hard. Things are starting to come out, but they're not in full bloom yet. So it might be one of those types of foods.
Molly,
Mhm.
I know that Alice talked about the leaves being used as a medicine
Mhm.
as a tea.
Mhm.
And Viva Ursi is very big for urinary tract
Mm.
infection.
Mhm.
And
Hmm.
so that was, something that the women
Mhm.
use. I don't know about smoking it, but definitely as a tea.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jane was saying that her mentor Alice has shared that the leaves are great for medicinal purpose as well. And but as familiar with smoking, and so I have a couple colleagues too who are looking at the residues of smoking within archaeological pipes from different collections, and they found tobacco in a lot of their pipes, but they've never found kinnikinnick for whatever reason. So that's another, could be just a product of chance, or maybe smoking kinnikinnick was a very recent phenomenon and it's not present in the deep time perspective. So more questions to ask about plants and people. I'll just skip forward a little bit to, I have this great graphic about how these features were used frequently, and that I think that people would have come back to these places time after time and favored the same cooking places. And it's a really social activity, getting together for a meal. We still do that for holidays. But I'll move on to, just want to share quickly some projects that we have going on, working with WCU and also the Kalispel tribe and a couple other folks too. So I've talked a little bit about camas management or stewardship. So one of the big things that I've spent my time working on lately is trying to understand how people may have managed camas fields in the past, so that we can bring those practices back and increase access and expand where fields are. We're working with also, I want to say U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Washington Fish and Wildlife tentatively have agreed to help us, but to use what we find about how people are managing camas fields and actually put it into practice so that they can expand their current camas fields, specifically so Indigenous and Native people can come back and harvest in the future. And so again, just some of the stuff that I've worked on is in the archaeological sites that I've looked at, we've been able to show that people were only harvesting camas bulbs that had already flowered and gone to seed. And so that's because camas takes 4 to 5 years to go to seed. So even though if you were, so I have on the third image right here, I'll show you right here. Right here is from this past summer when we were harvesting camas. And you can see you have all these little bulbs that come out once you still harvest the big bulb. You don't see those little bulbs archaeologically. So people were replanting those as they were going through the field. We think that they were probably also, because this is what it looks like when it's flowered and gone to seed, they would, and I've done this, you break it off and you just plant it. And these are the seeds that are getting ready to be replanted as well too, once you go on. So your digging stick is a very specialized tool specific. Like if you try to use a shovel, you're just gonna slice a bunch of bulbs in half. The digging stick will just pop them out, and then you go in and you replant your little tiny guys. And so some of the other projects that we're working on too, specifically with, I've talked to Brenda Beckwith about this, and we're hopefully gonna connect and start this, but thinking about the effect that dams have had on camas fields and the effects that, stopping soils from flowing naturally through these riparian systems and the other associated nutrients with those that has had in stripping these landscapes of the productivity that they would have had. And so comparing undammed versus dammed places, also thinking about if people were using fire to clear the ground and clear competitors and reintroduce nitrogen into the soil. And I've read about seaweed being added on the coast too. So we have a couple of different soil specific projects that we're going to look at too to try to figure out, how people were managing these things, specifically in the time depth associated with that. And so the last quick point I wanted to make on this one is just that I was able to show that for 3,500 years, people have been doing this. And prior to that, they probably weren't targeting immature versus mature bulbs. So you can really kind of nail down on just how long people have been intimately engaging with camas as a plant, and with incredible knowledge of this plant's life cycle and how they were able to work with that and create these productive and sustainable food systems for thousands and thousands of years. Did anyone have a question on that too? And I know that we're running a little long, so I don't want to hold you too late, but yes?
I know you said it, but I couldn't hear you. How long does it take to plant?
4 to 5 years. Yeah. And so Luther Burbank too used to experiment with camas a bunch, and he was able to, in a couple short generations, bring that down, but also to make bulbs bigger. But so some of what I argue too and think about is that people weren't like domesticating things the way we domesticate things contemporary. That wasn't even like on their radar. Instead, that they were thinking about how do we ensure sustainable harvests in the future? How do we make sure we can come back and keep using these plants and almost mimic habitats and expand productivity? There's a fantastic Wapato garden in British Columbia on the Fraser River where they built a little garden and they put a pavement of stones, and they found that that was also about the same time 3,800 years ago is what they dated those Wapato tubers to. So one of the projects that the tribe would like to do is to mimic that garden and grow Wapato again out on the river too. And so that's something that they would like to see happen, and maybe you guys would come out for a day or something if we were going to do something like that. But just an idea. Any other questions on that?
I don't know if people know what Wapato is.
So Wapato is what is it also called? Arrow leaf? Arrow.
It's the water, they call it water potato.
Water potato is another name. It grows usually in slow water, I think. I've seen it on the edge of the river here. I've also seen it in lakes and ponds, and it has like an arrow-shaped leaf kind of, and then it has a little tuber with, I don't know how to describe it. It's like purplish, but it's very starchy. And it was a big food for a lot of Coeur d'Alene people. They've done a lot of work with that. Yeah, Jane?
So Molly, I got with the tribe.
Yeah.
Travel for one of their culture camps, dig water potatoes.
Okay.
And you do it in the fall,
Mm-hmm.
and you do it barefooted in
Yeah.
the water with your
Mhm.
toes. And you know, we showed up in waders and boots, and the elders just laughed at us. And so it's really a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And what happens is when you are working the muck in the ground in a shallow area, and the tubers float to the top,
Mm-hmm.
and then you peel them immediately, and they're
Mhm.
beautiful. They're all kinds of colors: turquoise, lavender, pink. I mean, it was so much fun. And
Yeah.
they're delicious. They taste, when you boil them or bake them, they taste like a potato.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're real good. So I don't know if you guys heard that, but Jane was explaining how you walk in the water and then they like float up to the surface. So it's a lot easier than digging, I guess, but it's colder. But it is really good. Yeah. So there's a lot of cool work to do on that. Yes.
Are they still doing are they managing, they have a chemist on the Costco tribe, and they practicing these things to keep their chemists thriving?
So there are specific places that only tribal members are allowed to go harvest. And so they've been doing that for many years, but actually, so, and I'm not privy to everything either, right? Because I work with them, but I'm not a tribe member. So I know that, people do burn sometimes, they do some of this stuff, but I do know the past couple of years have really disrupted things as well with the pandemic. And so things haven't been quite the same for a little while. So that's why we're kind of trying to do it from a couple different angles. And I know that they're trying to also make a garden specifically up by the Indian Creek Work Center. So specific, so people can come and kind of harvest whenever instead of going out into the field, and it's a little more accessible. So it depends.
I asked that because I noticed around in this area, bands and also general development. I do construction around here, and Dover, for example, I've found huge patches of canvas. So like two springs ago, huge patch of canvas with a huge house here, huge house here. And so I harvested a bunch of canvas.
Mhm.
I didn't know that I harvested it during black seed. I did it when the flowers were blooming because I wanted to be sure it wasn't dead.
Mhm.
Sure enough, I came back this spring and there's a house on that path.
Mhm.
So I'm looking for places where we could potentially bring plants to a safe area, where and stay alive.
Well, maybe we can connect after and then talk about it, and I can try to put you in contact with some people who might be interested. And if not, you can cook it in a crock pot too. So you can experiment. And I know that people too are experimenting with canning it and drying it as well too. So even just bringing the bulbs, if you have no choice but to pull it all up, that might be something people would be interested in. Yeah. Well, I know we've gone long, so I don't have to talk about the last one. We're doing some experimental stuff too, because we don't actually know the nutritional content of camas or some of these other foods that we talked about today, for a variety of reasons. And I'd argue just because for a long time, no one was interested in this stuff besides the people who it matters to. And so this was this past fall, we did some experimental camas bakes to try to figure it out, but that one's ongoing. So anyway, I just wanted to say thank you so much. And that was a lot to run through, and we went long, but I loved having conversations over this whole course of things. And please reach out to me if you have questions, and or I can point you to the right contacts as well too. Yeah, one last question.
Like it.